Hello class and welcome to the second half of this week's lecture materials. We're going to move past the pre-contact era and into the era of contact, cooperation, and eventually conflict. So the second half of this lecture will be posted on Monday, and I think there's been just a teensy bit of confusion so far. I've seen some student emails that have been questioning what are we doing on Tuesdays and Thursdays, for instance. And again, as I mentioned before earlier in the semester, we're going to be posting the lecture materials on Mondays and Wednesdays. If you choose to watch them on Tuesday and Thursday during class time, that's totally up to you. You can totally make your own schedule for the way that the materials are distributed to you. They're just going to be put up on Mondays and Wednesdays to ensure that they'll be there for Tuesdays and Thursdays, but you can work in any way that you like. The only time, again, that course material matters for during class time is during the quizzes. And that's because you've all been scheduled to have this time open, so we can schedule quizzes for those specific moments. But aside from that, you're sort of the master of your own content consumption. So keep that in mind as we move along. Now, again, also some of you have been experiencing problems with the audio responses, and I talked about this briefly in the announcement today. But it is important that if you're having trouble viewing the content, first of all, again, make sure you're not using Safari. I'm so sorry about this. I don't know why that Moodle doesn't like Safari very much, but it doesn't. But you must contact me, and I'll get you in touch with Moodle support, and we'll get this figured out. But it seems as though the majority of you are not having any problems by the fact that we're having so many successful responses. So again, we're going to move past the question of contact and into, because as last week we discussed that contact is this evolving concept that's occurring in many different times and in many different eras and many different geographical spaces, and we're going to talk in this lecture about some of the consequences of that and some of the interactions that occur. And this directly relates to the John Lutz reading that I've had you read for this week as well. And that also relates to this week's form responses. So with that being said, let's get started on contact, cooperation, and conflict. So we're also going to begin a process that's going to become very familiar to you, and that is to say, move extremely fast through large periods of history. And that's a bit of a shame. I wish we could spend more detail on these various points in time. But again, it's important to keep the goal of the course in mind and our target destination in front of our minds as we move through what seems like really quickly through periods in history. But it is important that we discuss England and France, and we're not going to make this a discussion of 15th or 14th century Europe or the Middle Ages or even the 17th century or 16th centuries in Europe, but it does merit inclusion, and your textbook does a very good job going into greater detail. But to set the stage in any history course, any historical endeavor, it's about making choices. And it's very difficult to decide where to start to tell the story of pre-Confederation Canada. Do you start at their earliest recorded information regarding the indigenous peoples of North America? You could. You could start the story in the 11th century. You could start it in the 17th century. You could start in the 15th century, but choices have to be made. Belshaw does a great job describing that sort of fact. Let's make a decision here. If we're going to explain England and France's journey to the New World, we're going to make a decision to start their story, the England and France's side of the story, in the 14th century with the Black Death. The Black Death is something that's honestly hard to comprehend in terms of its devastation, in terms of its impact on European society. If you've taken a European history course, if you've had a skilled instructor in this region, I'm sure Wilson and Bell, for instance, at TRU could teach you a lot about this time period in Europe, but it transforms every aspect of European society during this period. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, it's got many different names, ravaged Europe, killing between 75 and 200 million people from 1347 to 1351. Well, there's a couple things here, and we're easing our way into the semester, so I want to go nice and slow there. This is something you'll notice. If this is your first history course, something you'll notice about historians is the obsession with documentation and an obsession with evidence. When we're talking about the 14th century, it's actually kind of difficult to come to any discernible or any real consensus regarding evidence. And what you should maybe perk your ears up was when you read that statistic given there. Between 75 and 200 million people, that's a huge range. I mean, that's very different numbers there. I mean, that's a lot of people different between 75 and 200 million people, of course. But just look at the time frame there as well. It's 4 years, really. I mean, it is an extremely short amount of time. and it's an extremely large amount of devastation. The reason that I pointed you out to the variation in numbers in terms of the estimates regarding how many died just is it's evident because of the problem of documentation the farther you go back in history. It's very difficult to come to unequivocal decisions regarding certain numbers like that when you're dealing with so many centuries in the past, something we're going to be dealing with over and over and over again. But again, keep that in mind. The 14th century, you have the Black Death. This is not a bad pandemic. This is an absolute species-altering event. 200 million people during the 14th century in terms of how many people lived on Earth is just staggering. Following the effects of the Black Death, England and France descended into the 100 Years' War from 1337 to 1453, which you might notice is longer than 100 years, over the question of who would succeed the throne to France. Now, this is just one aspect of the Black Death, one piece of the Black Death, one effect of the Black Death. But the 100 Years' War is directly related to the effects, the cultural, society, and geopolitical of the Black Death, and it descends England and France into a period of extended conflict. That's what's important for our purposes. Keep this in mind, that Britain and France do not like each other and are engaged in an intractable conflict that had taken place for longer than a century. Now again, we won't be able to get into the real weeds of the 100 Years' War, and if you're more interested in that subject matter, there's plenty of resources available for you, and I'm sure even wonderful courses here at TRU that you could take about it. But we're going to continue our moving quickly towards settlement in North America pretty soon here. But let's talk about the 100 Years' War first. It brought a period of domestic strife in England. In the Tudor dynasty, the monarchy became the main political force in England. The powers of Parliament waned, as did that of the lesser royals called the aristocracy. Henry VII governing council also dealt with the recalcitrant nobles by using the Star Chamber, which was a judicial body that undermined the traditions of English common law, and by promoting the interests of the middle class. So what's interesting there about the ways in which English society were changing during the 100 Years' War is that you start to see an emergence of this sort of middle class influence on the way that England was governed. Merchants, heavily concentrated in England's port towns, favored policies that enabled and protected trade. Their concerns thus became the concerns of the crown as well, and merchants favored seaborne trade. So we're trying to link here this period of real rapid exploration in England's history and in France's history as well, but England specifically in this sense. And we're trying to explain why they set off in ships across the Atlantic. Now, this domestic strife at home, this reorganization of power, the Star Chamber, for instance, is just one example of the ways in which English society during this period were evolving. And seaborne trade becoming a priority for the English aristocracy, and therefore the powers of Parliament, really sets the foreground for an age of exploration. And this brings us to John Cabot, one of many explorers that you may or may not have learned about in grade school. I'm not sure how the curriculums have evolved or changed. This is where I really do miss being in the classroom, where I could simply just pan the room and see what it is that you've learned and what you're familiar with. It's one of the great joys of being able to teach in that way. I'm always curious what your backgrounds are coming into this. When I was in about, I think, the 4th grade, there was a unit on explorers, and we learned about Samuel Champlain, John Cabot, and Jacques Cartier, and I think they've rethought the way that they teach a lot of these curriculums for good reason. I mean, it's very strange about the amount that we ask 4th graders to know about 6th, 7th, 8th century, long ago dead explorers from England, and how that impacts your daily life from as a 4th grader is a very tough connection to ask 4th grade educators to make, for instance. But so you may or may not know who John Cabot is, depending on also where you grew up in Canada, or maybe you're not from Canada at all. Maybe you're from other countries, maybe you're from the United States, maybe you're from somewhere else in the world. His name might mean nothing to you. So let's talk a little bit about this frowning, bearded gentleman depicted there on your slide, John Cabot. It was under Henry VII, then, that England made its first official foray into overseas exploration. In May of 1497, some historians claim it was 7 years later, so there's, again, a problem of evidence here. We're going to talk about that as we move on. And as you being budding historians, you're going to talk about this problem of evidence as we move closer and closer to the present. A Venetian mariner living in London, that means he lived in Venice, or what is now Venice, Italy, living in London to sail under the English flag in an attempt to find a northern route to Asia. Cabot reached what he called Newfoundland, in June of that year and claimed it on behalf of the king, his patron. He made a second voyage in 1498, funded in part by Henry VII, who expected to reap the financial rewards of the journey. However, this second exploration that Cabot makes results in Cabot dying. And after Cabot's death, his crew, led by his son Sebastian, failed to find any precious metals, so Henry lost interest in overseas exploration, Henry VII that is. So basically, again, if you think about this evolving English society and this evolution in terms of priorities and how they're shifting, the English crown said, we would love to send explorers abroad, but it's got to be worth it for us. We're going to need to get something in return, right? So not just paying for you guys to go and sail around and explore and plant flags, that's great. But once you get there, there better be some value in it for the crown. That this was a financial transaction in that way. Fortunately, none of the transaction paid off for the crown, and they basically said, well, this is a complete waste of time. What are we doing? And lost interest in under Henry VII, that is. Let's go back to that first landing, though, 1497. Again, because we're really talking about this as a sort of historical issue in terms of problems of evidence and problems of recording and problems of how do we know what we know about the past. Well, there are no clear details from this landfall. We actually can't even be certain that the place that Cabot arrived was present-day Newfoundland. Cabot went ashore briefly, declared possession for England by raising a flag, and then sailed along the coast, absorbing the land and the great schools of fish, and that's important. He arrives in what is perhaps modern-day Newfoundland and notices just an absolute treasure trove of fish. In early August of 1497, he returned to London to inform the king of his discoveries and collect his reward. This second voyage, again in 1498, was lost at sea, and though a few fishermen may have been catching cod off Newfoundland around 1480, and we'll explain this a little bit later in this course, it was John Cabot's reports of a vast cod fishery off the shores of the, quote, New Isle that sparked widespread European interest in the Americas. That's even outside of England. So Cabot comes back and says, I don't have any precious metals for you. It was a pretty successful voyage. It was a pretty cold place. We planted a flag, but man, you should have seen the fish that were there. Following Cabot's first visit, he returned with stories about a place where cod appeared so thick a person could, quote, walk across their backs. Now, why is this important? Why do we care about the fish that John Cabot found in those days? Well, if you think about the challenges of sea voyages during this period, the ability to feed yourself reliably once you arrive on this new destination makes the prospect of future voyages far more attainable, far more appealing, far better investment on the part of the kings. You're not going to be sending people over there to starve to death and die or rely solely on what you can fit on a boat going across the Atlantic from England. So Cabot's story about these fish that were so plentiful that you could walk across them like as if you were walking on water, a lot of other European rulers and members of the aristocracy in other countries start looking around being like, okay, well, maybe we can set up encampments there. Maybe we can set up permanent settlements if they can be sustainable once they've arrived there. And we can really go in there and get those precious metals and make this really financially worth it. So this leads us now to the discussion of the exploration across the Atlantic from other countries. And again, we are moving very quickly. And this does not do this period justice. And I've just got to say that as a disclaimer. There is a lot more that can be said about this specific time period. But we make choices, and Belshaw mentioned this as well in the textbook. You make choices about the parts that you're going to focus on, and we're trying to get ourselves into a sort of holistic understanding of what was going on in pre-Confederation Canada. So we're having to move quickly. Let's talk about the French explorers. Jacques Cartier. Now, maybe that name means a lot to you, maybe it means absolutely nothing to you, but it's just this context of exploration across the Atlantic from warring nations between England and France. Keep that in mind. Between 1534 and 1542, the first voyages led by Cartier made contact with local peoples, including the Micmac, Montagnais, Algonquin, and the St. Lawrence Iroquois. Significantly, Cartier was instructed to, quote, discover certain islands and lands where it is said that a great quantity of gold and other precious things are to be found. So Cartier is leaving again with strict orders from the person paying for the voyage that says, make this worth my investment. This is a financial transaction in the minds of the crowns that sponsor these voyages. So it's not purely about discovery. Maybe it was for some of the people on the boat, but for the people paying the bills, they thought this is I am likely to get our nation enriched to help fight wars in some senses as well. We'll talk about that also at the end of this class and at the beginning of next one. Cartier made contact with the St. Lawrence Iroquois on the Gaspé, where he offered his hosts where he offended his hosts, by erecting a large cross bearing the words, "Long live the King of France." Not exactly a hospitable gesture on the part of someone who had just traveled a long way and whose grip on survival was fairly tenuous. A year later, he returned, venturing into the St. Lawrence River and moving westward. So if you can picture the St. Lawrence again from modern day Quebec, he's starting to move further and further inland. Cartier's team visited the largest village, which he regarded as the, quote, capital of the St. Lawrence Iroquois, near the site of present-day Quebec City. This was Stadacona, and its chief was Donnacona. So again, these are Cartier's assertions about what he was finding. Its actual purpose and presence in the indigenous communities that lived there was far different, right? And we're going to start to see a very, very important miscommunication aspect of Cartier's voyages here. Now, your supplementary videos, one of them is a heritage moment that depicts sort of one of these moments in Cartier's voyage where he meets with the local Iroquois and they discuss where they're going to meet, and there's this miscommunication. Now, this is a really important sort of moment in Canadian sort of public history as well, when we start telling the stories to a larger public in the 20th century. Maybe you're not familiar with heritage moments, but when I was growing up, they were on television commercials, and now they're mostly just YouTube ads, to be honest, but they were publicly financed reenactments of historical moments of significance throughout Canadian history. So the one that's on your supplemental viewings is an important one to mention, because it underscores this miscommunication that would occur over and over and over again, sometimes out of ignorance and sometimes out of malice and sometimes out of just sheer coincidence. But this inability to make meaningful contact originally, right out the way, led to some very, very, very tumultuous times between certain explorer parties and local indigenous peoples. Now, the article that you posted also in your supplemental materials this week addresses this in more detail, and we'll be getting at that in your form response this week. That's the McCook article from John Lutz. It was on this second tour that Cartier traveled further upriver to another large settlement, Hochelaga. Unlike Stadacona, Hochelaga was fortified with a triple palisade of wood. The town contained about 3,000 people and was surrounded by cornfields, so it was agriculturally significant as well. Its location remains a source of historical debate, but there's a general agreement that it was near the foot of what Cartier called Mount Royal, that is, Montreal, though on which side is uncertain. Cartier's expedition returned downriver to Stadacona, where they spent an especially cold and difficult winter. Most of the crew died from cold and scurvy. The good news was a cure was provided by the Stadaconans that mitigated the vitamin C deficiency that causes scurvy, and without which the whole of the French expedition would have been doomed. Keep this in mind, okay? Very important. Despite Cartier's erratic and consistently ungrateful behavior, and that's probably a euphemism on the part of Bellechasse here. I mean, erecting a giant cross is almost hostile. I would say that the documentation that exists suggests a hostile attitude at times towards local indigenous peoples. Despite losing 50 of his own men, evidently to the ailments introduced by the Europeans, Donnacona supported the foreigners through the winter. This support is the only reason that we have the history that we do in this region. It is the only reason that Cartier's parties survive. It is the absolute only reason they don't just die there at Stadacona, or died somewhere up on the St. Lawrence, or at any point in time just taken by those cold winters that would have been something that, if growing up in France you were accustomed to winter, but nothing like if you've experienced a winter in Canada, and many or all of you had perhaps at some point. I mean, maybe you will be experiencing your first Canadian winter this year, but it is nothing can prepare you at some points, especially if I grew up in Alberta, and my goodness, it just gets unspeakably cold sometimes. If you've spent a winter in Saskatchewan or Manitoba, you know what I'm talking about, or even Quebec. I found Montreal winters to be just brutal. There's no way to adequately prepare yourself if you've never gone through that. If it wasn't for the knowledge shared by the Stadaconans, this history ends with this, and the story goes, isn't that strange that a bunch of French sailors came over and died twice? Right? That's how different this story would have went down. And at this point in the story, his ungrateful behavior from Cartier's party turns into duplicitous behavior. The Iroquois leader made the mistake of telling Cartier about metal sources upriver, likely copper around Lake Superior, though we don't know for sure about which precious metal was mentioned here. This set off Cartier's gold fever. That's the word that Belshai uses, and it's interesting because, again, if you recall, that was his mandate, right? That was what his boss sent him off to do. That's the whole purpose of this journey. The reduced French party would have to be reinforced, and in order to do that, Cartier would have to first return to France and sell the court of Francis I on the idea of further investment. It is impossible to understand exploration in this period without understanding that core fact, that there is a financial transactional dimension to exploration in this period, and Cartier and Cabot and all of the like were affected by those pressures, financial ones. So after the first sort of winter there that wiped out so many, Cartier realized that any exploration over to get precious metals would require reinforcements, would require different types of resources, would require more men. He'd need to go back to France to do it. To that end, and with an eye to supporting a local coup, Cartier abducted Donnacona, chief of the Stadaconans, his sons, and 7 other Stadaconans, and took them all to France. This is a moment of extremely contentious relations between the Cartier party and the Stadaconans. He kidnaps the chief, basically decapitates the head of the society, not in a literal sense, in a figurative sense, and 9 of 10 perished, and the 10th never returned to Canada. So if you were Stadaconan, what happened in that moment was 10 people were taken and never returned. Might as well have just been shot right there. Right? This is an extremely hostile act on the part of Cartier. Kidnapping Donnacona is a moment of betrayal. So Cartier returns to France with Donnacona and with his sons, with several high-ranking members of the Stadaconan society, and he returns for the final time in 1541. And remarkably, the records that we have from Cartier's own party say that they were received warmly. However, that didn't last very long. In that year, the French made the last attempt of this century at establishing a colonial foothold in Canada. That's not the last attempt that was made, but of the 16th century. Cartier led a settlement cohort of 300 French to Charlesbourg-Royal, a site now identified as Cap-Rouge, near Stadacona. But this settlement lasted barely a year, beset as it was by bad weather and hostility from the Stadaconans, whose hospitality and generosity Cartier had repeatedly scorned. Now again, you might even look at this and say, well, it almost lasted a year. That's pretty impressive. But note the size of the party. He comes back with 300 French who were there to settle. They were there with the intention of establishing permanent footholds. So different mindsets. They understand the journey better. They're less are debilitated when they arrive. They understand a lot of what it takes to survive there. Knowing all these things, having all of these resources, and having the manpower still doesn't get them through a year because they don't have the Stadaconans on their side any longer. This relationship, which could have evolved differently, this could have gone in different ways, this is not an inevitability, and this is something that we must fight against when we study history from this period and any period, is this idea of the inevitability of history, right? Cartier's party, as all people do, and you and I do, we make choices, right? We privilege certain things over others. We make certain decisions to serve certain masters in some senses, if you're thinking about Cartier's party, but those come with consequences. And these consequences for centuries rang out in this region. And losing the support of the Stadaconans was ultimately extremely deleterious to Cartier's party. Now again, this is where we're going to end for today. We're going to end on this sort of almost like a cliffhanger note here with the way that Cartier's party ends up. But the themes from today are important. It's what's going on in Europe, right? Let's remember back to when we briefly talked about the Black Death. What is causing the British and the French to reach out, right, to go across the Atlantic, to pay the expense of doing these things. Expense not just in terms of dollars and cents or gold in this sense, but also in terms of human lives. Why do it? Why bother, right? We're starting to learn the pressures and what the economic reasons for expansion, and we're starting to learn about the importance of communication upon arrival, about the importance of cooperation in some senses, or what happens when cooperation ceases. But again, we're talking about these early moments of contact in North American history, or in this sense, Canadian history. But again, this is not when history begins by any stretch of the imagination. This is a choice that we've made in this sense. And there's lots of history to study before these moments. There's the entire history of the indigenous peoples from these regions that are an important part of this. And we're going to get into more detail regarding indigenous peoples' history throughout the entirety of this course. But we have to make certain choices just to establish narratives. And Belshot is a great example of that in his textbook. So again, on Monday, the next half of this lecture will continue, and we will continue on with the journey of this early period in the history of pre-Confederation Canadian history.